Claire Barrett arrived at the Manhattan notary office, believing she would merely face the painful end of her marriage. But instead, she walked into a calculated trap set with elegant smiles and cruel legal clauses. Carter Sterling, the husband who had once promised to protect her forever, sat quietly next to his formidable mother, ready to hand Claire a separation agreement, meticulously designed to leave her with absolutely nothing. What the Sterling family completely failed to realize was that Claire understood the immense weight of a signature better than anyone else in that room. Before her pen could even brush the pristine paper, a single deliberate question would begin to transform their predatory agreement into undeniable evidence against all of them. Today, you walk out of here without a husband, without a home, and without the right to use our prestigious last name, said Rose Sterling, her voice carrying a polished calmness that seemed perfectly rehearsed in the grand mirrors of her Upper East Side penthouse. The private conference room in the downtown legal district was vast, freezing, and entirely silent, featuring a dark mahogany table in the center where stacks of legal documents were arranged as if a woman's entire life could be dismantled in alphabetical order. Claire Barrett sat on the opposite side of the heavy table, wearing a simple beige dress, her hair neatly tied at the nape of her neck, and her hands resting gently over the small purse in her lap. Carter Sterling absolutely refused to look directly into her eyes, maintaining a rigid jawline, while his wildly expensive watch peeked out from under the tailored sleeve of his navy blue suit. Do not complicate this any more than you already have. Claire, he muttered softly, while Penelope Andrews, the family's sharp legal consultant, leaned her body forward with a razor-thin smile. It is an incredibly generous settlement for someone who entered into this high-profile marriage without bringing a single asset to the table, Penelope added, tapping her manicured fingers against a thick leather folder. Claire raised her calm eyes not to the arrogant lawyer but directly to the quiet clerk, who was nervously waiting for the official order to begin reading the terms. Before any signatures are placed on these pages, I want to hear every single clause read out loud, Claire stated with a serene, unshakable voice that made the air in the room suddenly feel incredibly heavy. Rose let out a short, breathy laugh, sounding exactly like someone who was mildly amused by a foolish child demanding complex explanations about serious adult affairs. Have you always enjoyed pretending that you actually understand the intricate world of corporate business, my dear? The older woman murmured, slowly adjusting the heavy gold bracelet resting on her perfectly moisturized wrist. But this is very simple. You agree to leave our lives discreetly, the family preserves its immaculate reputation, and nobody ever needs to know that your marriage failed because you simply could not handle the position you were graciously given. Claire felt the venomous phrase slide into her chest slowly, a familiar agonizing sensation similar to a paper cut that she had endured for 3 agonizing years. Throughout their marriage, she had heard countless variations of that exact same poison during extravagant charity dinners, silent elevator rides, forced family holidays, and voicemails left on speakerphone entirely by accident. Carter finally took a deep, shaky breath, lifting his gaze to meet hers for a fleeting, guilty second before speaking. My mother simply wants to avoid a public scandal, that is all, he softly explained, as if that pathetic excuse justified the absolute destruction of their vows. Claire effortlessly sustained his weak gaze and asked a question that shattered his fragile defense. And what exactly are you trying to avoid, Carter? The public scandal, or the actual truth? Penelope quickly tapped the edge of her black folder with the tips of her fingers, eager to redirect the conversation back to the carefully drafted paperwork. The undeniable truth is that Mrs. Sterling has graciously offered much more than she was legally obligated to provide, Penelope stated. The luxury apartment remains with the family, the imported vehicles remain with the corporate fleet, the company's shares stay untouched, and you receive a transitional monetary sum to peacefully move on with your insignificant life. Claire calmly turned her attention back to the anxious clerk, gesturing gracefully with one hand. "Please begin reading from the very first page," she instructed, entirely ignoring the lawyer's hostile summary. The clerk cleared his throat, nervously, adjusted his thick glasses, and initiated the reading with that highly trained robotic neutrality of someone who constantly witnessed broken couples saying goodbye through pure rage, deep shame, or cold calculation. While he droned on about consensual dissolution, strict confidentiality agreements, and the complete waiver of any future financial claims, Claire quietly observed the micro-movements happening around the freezing room. Penelope obsessively checked her glowing smartphone every 2 minutes, her anxiety barely concealed beneath her designer suit. Rose maintained her fingers elegantly intertwined, but her left thumb forcefully pressed into her right hand, betraying a crack in her composed facade. Carter impatiently tapped his expensive leather shoe beneath the wooden table, acting as if Claire's entirely reasonable delay was just another frustrating flaw she exhibited as a disobedient wife. Outside the frosted glass door, the muffled sounds of New York City rose through the walls, distant taxi horns, elevators chiming, and the hurried footsteps of thousands of people continuing their busy lives, while inside Claire's identity was being systematically erased. When the nervous clerk finally reached the dense section regarding marital assets, Claire slightly tilted her head to the side. "Please, repeat that specific sentence," she requested, her voice cutting through the monotonous reading like a sharp knife. Rose immediately stiffened in her luxurious leather chair. "Claire, do not start your dramatic theatrics now," her mother-in-law warned, but Claire completely ignored the harsh reprimand. The clerk hesitated for a brief moment, then nervously reread the complex paragraph, stating that Claire fully recognized she possessed no direct, indirect, or expected rights over any wealth related to the Sterling family, including all assets supposedly transferred, guaranteed, or moved during their entire matrimony. Claire breathed in slowly, letting the word guaranteed hang suspended over the polished wooden table like a single drop of dark ink falling onto a pristine white cloth. She vividly remembered hearing that exact same word on a rainy night several months earlier when she had quietly walked past the grand library in the penthouse and caught Rose hastily shutting a black leather folder with suspicious urgency. At that time, Carter had casually dismissed her concerns, claiming they were just boring supplier contracts that would never interest her. Claire had forced herself to believe him, or perhaps she had desperately wanted to believe him because she was still exhausted from trying to salvage some tiny fragment of tenderness inside a marriage that had already become a poorly managed business. Now, with her voice perfectly controlled and devoid of any trembling, she asked the question they were all dreading. Exactly which specific assets were guaranteed during the course of our matrimony? Penelope smiled much wider this time, but her sharp eyes completely lost their confident sparkle. "It is simply standard legal phrasing, nothing for you to worry your pretty head about," the lawyer lied smoothly. Claire casually turned a page of the document without ever reaching for the expensive pen placed before her. Is it standard phrasing for someone who is simply getting a divorce? Or is it standard phrasing for someone who is secretly transferring massive corporate liabilities? Carter deeply furrowed his brow, looking genuinely lost for the first time that morning. "What on earth are you talking about, Claire?" he asked, his confusion momentarily overriding his rehearsed indifference. Rose violently leaned forward before Claire could utter a single word in response. "She is not talking about anything real. She is just desperately trying to buy more time because she has always been this pathetic and dramatic whenever she fails to get exactly what she wants. Rose spat out her elegant mask, slipping to reveal the ruthless matriarch underneath. Claire looked directly into Carter's eyes and softly replied, "I merely want to fully understand the exact terms I am being aggressively pressured to sign today." For the very first time that morning, Carter shifted his gaze away from his domineering mother and looked down at the thick legal folder resting on the table. The clerk continued reading the dense text, now looking significantly less comfortable, making the large conference room suddenly feel suffocatingly small. Each complicated legal word that was spoken aloud seemed to strip away another tiny layer of the fabricated elegance Rose had carried into the room. The subsequent clause detailed a comprehensive retroactive authorization designed to legally validate any unknown documents signed in Claire's name throughout their marriage, specifically concerning the aggressive financial restructuring of the vast Sterling Corporation. Claire felt her stomach painfully contract, but she absolutely refused to let her facial expression shift or betray her internal shock. Instead, she slowly reached into her modest purse, her slender fingers tracing the smooth cap of an old dark metal pen that her father had gifted her on the day she originally moved to New York. Arthur Barrett had told her on that emotional day, speaking with the quiet, grounding presence of a man accustomed to speaking very little, but accomplishing monumental things. "My beautiful daughter, never be afraid to fall deeply in love, but absolutely never surrender your signature to anyone who gets deeply offended when you choose to read before signing." Back then, she had thought the advice was far too cynical for a joyful newlywed heading into the big city. Now sitting in this freezing room surrounded by vipers, it felt like the only genuinely loving sentence anyone had spoken to her regarding this doomed marriage. "Retroactive authorization," Claire repeated aloud, letting the heavy syllables sink into the silence. Penelope responded far too quickly, her tone defensive. "It is merely a standard formality to regularize mundane administrative procedures that occurred over the last 3 years." Claire tilted her chin up slightly, her eyes locking onto the lawyer. "Mundane administrative procedures executed secretly in my name." Carter shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his perfectly styled hair suddenly looking a bit disheveled. "Penelope, what exactly are these specific documents she is referring to?" he demanded, his voice laced with sudden anxiety. Rose tightly gripped her expensive handbag until her knuckles turned completely white. "Carter, please do not be so incredibly naive. Your wife is merely putting on a ridiculous theatrical performance for the clerk." The word "wife" shot out of Rose's mouth, sounding like a filthy accusation rather than a sacred bond. Claire acutely realized that Carter was finally starting to grow restless, but tragically, he was still not upset on her behalf. He was simply terrified by the growing possibility that he did not actually know everything. That fundamental difference in his anxiety hurt Claire far more than his previous emotional coldness ever did. For 3 agonizing years, Claire had desperately waited for a moment when he would finally recognize the crushing loneliness she constantly carried while living inside his incredibly toxic family. She had patiently waited when Rose intentionally seated her at the farthest end of the grand dining table during crucial investor dinners. She had waited when Penelope confidently paraded into family meetings and was openly treated as the brilliant future of the Sterling Empire, while Claire was dismissively sent to the kitchen to check if the fresh coffee was adequately prepared. She had waited even when Carter consistently accepted his mother's oppressive silence as the only valid solution to their marital problems. Now breathing the recycled air of that sterile legal office, she finally understood that she had tragically confused infinite patience with foolish hope. I have the absolute legal right to a full unedited copy of everything before I provide any signature, Claire announced with unyielding authority. Penelope slammed both of her hands flat onto the mahogany table. You already received the complete document package yesterday afternoon at your apartment, the lawyer hissed. Claire calmly nodded her head. I did indeed receive a version containing exactly 22 pages. However, the document resting on this table currently has 31 pages. The timid clerk immediately snapped his head up his eyes, darting between the warring women. Carter turned his body sharply toward Penelope, his face pale with sudden realization. Rose remained perfectly still, almost unnaturally frozen like a marble statue, anticipating a strike. Down below on the busy Manhattan Avenue, a long, blaring taxi horn pierced the thick glass window like a desperate warning siren. Penelope forcefully swallowed and recovered her professional voice with immense effort. They were simply minor technical adjustments made late last night. She lied her eyes, refusing to meet Claire's steady gaze. Claire slowly flipped through the thick stack of papers until she reached a specific page, prominently marked in the upper corner, where someone had clumsily attempted to cover a number with a white label. Then, let us thoroughly discuss these minor technical adjustments right now, Claire suggested smoothly. She purposefully paused at clause 13, a number that looked far too small to carry such a devastating amount of financial poison. Right here, it explicitly states that I acknowledge authorizing the use of my personal name in massive financial guarantees tied to Sterling Holdings, and that I permanently waive any right to question any transaction supposedly executed for my benefit or the benefit of our marriage. Rose forced another condescending smile, but this time there was a frantic, desperate rush hidden behind her perfectly whitened teeth. Exactly, my dear. You lived luxuriously within this wealthy family. You freely used the private driver, the heavy security detail, the massive Hamptons house, and the limitless platinum credit cards. Do not sit here now and pretend you did not happily benefit from our immense fortune. Claire felt her cheeks flush warmly, not from any sense of shame, but from a pure, incredibly silent rage that did not need to scream to prove its absolute existence. I occupied a single bedroom in your massive house, Rose. I absolutely never used my personal signature to fraudulently cover the catastrophic debts of your failing corporate empire. Carter went entirely pale, looking as if all the blood had been drained from his body. Debts, he whispered, the single word echoing loudly. Penelope aggressively slammed her leather folder shut with a loud crack. Claire is intentionally distorting complex financial terms that she simply does not possess the intellect to comprehend. The lawyer snapped defensively. Claire completely ignored her and looked directly at the wide-eyed clerk. Please officially record in the permanent minutes that the interested party formally requests full clarification regarding Clause 13 before providing any signature whatsoever. The clerk caught terribly between his strict professional protocol and the explosive tension in the room, began rapidly typing on his keyboard. The loud clacking sound of the plastic keys seemed to irritate Rose far more than any direct accusation Claire had made. She leaned aggressively across the table toward Claire, aggressively dropping her voice to a vicious whisper, though it was still loud enough for everyone to hear. Do you honestly believe you can successfully threaten us just because you memorized 2 or 3 fancy legal terms? Without Carter, you immediately go back to being absolutely nobody. A plain girl without a prestigious last name, without any high society influence, and without a single piece of visible wealth. Your mysterious father, whoever the hell he is certainly not sitting here to finance your pathetic insolence. Sadidi Claire felt the cruel insult strike a very old, deeply protected place in her heart, a sacred space that existed long before this toxic marriage. She thought warmly of Arthur Barrett far away in the rolling green hills of Kentucky, with his hard, calloused hands that he proudly kept despite owning suits that cost more than luxury cars. She thought of the quiet, brilliant man who strongly preferred to close massive international contracts in absolute silence rather than flaunt his immense wealth on the shiny covers of elite business magazines. She remembered every single time he had desperately wanted to intervene in her miserable marriage, and how she had stubbornly begged him to stay away. Claire had desperately wanted to be truly loved without the incredibly heavy weight of the Barrett empire entering the room before she did. She had wanted to be chosen simply for being Claire, not for being the sole heir to Arthur's massive fortune. And looking back, that deeply romantic desire had perhaps been her most painful, catastrophic mistake. She leveled a completely fearless gaze at Rose and replied, "You are actually entirely correct about one specific thing today. My father did not walk into this legal office with me." She allowed a heavy, dramatic pause to stretch across the room. "But that certainly does not mean he is unaware of exactly where I am sitting right now." Carter slowly lifted himself an inch out of his leather chair, looking as if Claire's cryptic sentence had just blasted open a hidden door directly behind him. "Claire, what exactly does that mean?" he demanded, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and confusion. She deliberately chose not to answer him right away. Instead, she calmly reached into her purse, retrieved the dark metal pen her father had given her, and placed it gently on the table without removing the cap. Rose let out a sharp, mocking laugh filled with pure disdain. "Are you seriously going to try and transform a cheap little pen into a dramatic threat now?" Claire slowly traced the cold metallic edge of the pen with her thumb. "No, I simply brought the very last thing my father explicitly asked me to never ever forget." Penelope stared intently at the dark pen, and for one terrifying microscopic second, she seemed to truly recognize its unique vintage design. The flash of sheer panic in the lawyer's eyes was so incredibly fast that Carter completely missed it, but Claire saw it vividly and stored it away. "When I legally married into your family," Claire continued smoothly, "I signed extensive asset protection documents that I purposely never mentioned inside your house, simply because my marriage was never supposed to be a hostile business negotiation." Rose tightly pursed her heavily painted lips. "That is an absolute ridiculous lie," she spat out. Claire leaned slightly forward, resting her arms on the table. "If that is a lie, then why exactly does your precious Clause 13 desperately attempt to force me to permanently waive my legal right to question massive financial guarantees that were fraudulently issued using my personal name?" The agonizing silence that immediately followed was not empty. It was practically overflowing with sheer, unadulterated terror. Carter stared blankly at his mother with a horrific expression that Claire had never witnessed before, a tragic mixture of profound doubt and a deeply shattered reality. For the very first time that morning, Carter looked significantly less like a treacherous, arrogant husband, and much more like a devastated son rapidly discovering the immense architecture of his own willful blindness. Rose desperately attempted to physically compose herself and reclaim her old dictatorial authority. "That is quite enough of this nonsense, Claire. You are going to sign this paperwork right this second, or you will walk out of this prestigious building without a single cent of the transitional money we generously offered." The vicious threat was designed to sound incredibly final, but it had completely lost its intimidating power. Claire calmly picked up her glass of water, took a very small, deliberate sip, and placed it back down exactly on the same damp, circular ring it had previously occupied. I absolutely refuse to sign a legal document that has had pages secretly swapped in the middle of the night. I refuse to sign a permanent waiver regarding massive financial operations that I have zero knowledge of. I refuse to sign a retroactive authorization allowing anyone to fraudulently use my personal identity. And most importantly, I will not sign a single page while my personal legal representative for my protected private assets is not physically present in this room. Penelope's face turned a violent, blotchy shade of bright red. Legal representative, you never officially informed my office that you had retained outside counsel for this standard procedure. Claire shifted her cold eyes directly onto the sweating lawyer. I was under no obligation to inform you of anything. Carter aggressively ran his trembling hand through his perfectly styled hair, completely losing the impeccable, untouchable image he always projected during high-stakes board meetings in the financial district. Claire, if there is absolutely anything I do not know about these corporate guarantees, you need to tell me right now. The sheer audacity of his desperate plea almost made her laugh out loud. He aggressively wanted to know everything right now after spending 3 entire years actively choosing to ignore her pain. I desperately needed to speak to you so many times, Carter. You only found it remotely convenient to actually listen to my voice when your own precious signature began facing the exact same catastrophic legal risks as mine. Suddenly, heavy, authoritative footsteps echoed loudly outside in the long corridor. They were not the rushed, anxious steps of a lowly clerk, nor the nervous pacing of a late client. They carried a heavy, terrifying calmness, a profound, ancient certainty that seemed to physically command the space before the person even appeared. Penelope's expensive smartphone vibrated violently on the table. She quickly glanced at the glowing screen and instantly lost every single drop of color in her face. Rose acutely noticed the lawyer's sheer panic, practically snatching the device with her eyes, and fiercely whispered, "Who is it?" Penelope was too paralyzed to formulate a response. Carter, who was still awkwardly standing, turned his entire body toward the frosted glass door. At the exact moment, a terrified administrative assistant carefully opened it. "Mrs. Claire Barrett," the assistant announced with excessive professional caution. "Mr. Arthur Barrett has just arrived in the lobby with his entire legal team." "How? Tud. The powerful name crashed down upon the arrogant Sterling family like a massive slab of solid marble plummeting directly onto the center of the mahogany table. Rose blinked rapidly, frantically, searching through her extensive high society memories to recall exactly where she had heard that specific weighty surname outside of her despised daughter-in-law's mouth. Penelope tightly squeezed her eyes shut for an agonizing second, looking exactly like a trapped animal, finally comprehending that the elaborate illegal snare she had built was accidentally triggered on an apex predator. Claire did not offer a victorious smile. She merely picked up her father's pen, safely tucked it back into her purse, and stared directly at the fraudulent papers. "Now we may finally continue the reading," Claire stated calmly. Arthur Barrett stepped into the tense conference room without a single ounce of nervous haste, and perhaps that quiet, unbothered confidence was exactly what disturbed the Sterling family the most. He certainly did not look like a frantic father who had been desperately called to save his helpless daughter from a humiliating divorce. Instead, he moved like a powerful man who already intimately knew the building, the exact layout of the room, the terrified faces sitting at the table, and the precise, catastrophic mistake each of them was about to make. Arthur wore a stunningly tailored dark charcoal suit, entirely devoid of flashy brand labels, a deep sapphire tie that was perfectly aligned, his distinguished silver hair neatly combed back, and a stoic facial expression that never needed to shout to successfully impose absolute silence. Directly behind him walked three formidable attorneys, two men and one woman, all carrying incredibly thin leather briefcases and glowing tablets. They radiated that terrifying, expensive discretion typical of the highest corporate floors in Manhattan, where nobody ever needed to raise their voice because the devastating financial consequences of their actions spoke clearly enough. Claire completely refused to stand up, simply inhaling deeply, as if for the very first time that incredibly long morning, the recycled air inside the room did not physically burn her lungs. Arthur immediately looked at his daughter before acknowledging a single other soul in the room. "Are you doing well, my daughter?" he asked gently. In that remarkably simple word, there was infinitely more fierce protection and genuine warmth than in all the miserable years Carter had ever referred to Claire as his wife. Rose turned a sickly shade of white upon hearing the affectionate term. Carter remained entirely frozen, his mind desperately trying to process the shifting reality. Penelope embarrassingly lowered her eyes back to the fraudulent document, desperately acting as if a miraculous escape clause might magically appear in the narrow margins. The deeply confused clerk, caught awkwardly between the rigid formality of his job and the brutal, terrifying shift in the room's atmosphere, stood up almost instinctively, out of sheer respect. "I am Harper Sinclair," the lead female attorney announced gracefully, placing a heavy, embossed business card directly onto the table. "I am the senior partner responsible for the comprehensive asset protection of Mrs. Claire Barrett. We formally request that the permanent minutes reflect our physical arrival prior to any signatures being executed." Harper did not pause for breath. "Furthermore, we demand that absolutely no version of this separation agreement be physically removed from this room under any circumstances." Penelope reacted far too quickly, her voice cracking slightly. "That is entirely unnecessary and highly aggressive. We are currently engaged in a peaceful, consensual attempt at conjugal dissolution." Arthur finally shifted his piercing gaze toward the sweating lawyer. There was absolutely zero visible anger on his weathered face, only a hyper-focused, incredibly clean attention that seemed to violently rip away Penelope's professional layers one by one. "Consensual counselor." Arthur stated, his voice a low, terrifying rumble, "is when nobody maliciously swaps 20 pages of a legal contract the night before a meeting and fraudulently labels it a minor technical adjustment." The heavy silence that immediately descended upon the room was no longer born of mere surprise. It was the suffocating silence of absolute, undeniable recognition. Rose desperately forced herself to physically recover, straightening her posture as if she were still hosting a lavish charity gala on the Upper East Side, heavily surrounded by fawning photographers and endless trays of expensive champagne. "Sir, you must be terribly misinformed. Claire has always been treated with the utmost respect within this family." Claire slowly lowered her eyes for a brief moment, absolutely not out of shame, but simply to conceal exactly how much that repulsive, blatant lie still managed to twist a knife in her old emotional wounds. Arthur responded without ever raising his calm, steady voice. "In that case, there will be absolutely no problem whatsoever if we take the time to read every single word of these documents." Carter aggressively rubbed his trembling hand across his pale face, and for the very first time since the morning began, he looked far more exhausted than arrogant. He vaguely recognized the immense weight of the Barrett name now. It was absolutely not the kind of flashy wealth that constantly dominated tabloid headlines. It was the terrifying invisible type of money tied to massive generational equestrian estates in Kentucky, sprawling agricultural empires, countless discrete luxury developments across the country, and vast corporate holdings that rarely required their owners to pose for magazine covers. Now, as Arthur gracefully took the empty seat right next to Claire, Carter's mind began frantically connecting the tiny, seemingly irrelevant clues he had foolishly ignored for 3 years. He remembered an elderly distinguished driver named Joseph, who frequently picked Claire up, and who always politely but firmly refused any financial tips. He suddenly recalled a mysterious phone call she had quickly rejected in the middle of a lavish dinner party, softly explaining that her father absolutely hated discussing high-level business at the dining table. He thought of a deceptively simple, vintage gold necklace that Rose had once cruelly mocked as cheap and provincial, but which an elite Manhattan jeweler had later examined with shocking, obsessive reverence. "Claire!" Carter whispered her name softly, his voice cracking as he desperately tried to find some logical explanation in her eyes that might somehow spare him from the crushing reality of his own pathetic blindness. "Why did you never tell me?" She looked back at him with a profound, unbreakable serenity that hurt him significantly more than any screaming accusation ever could. "Because I desperately needed to know if you would actively choose to love and protect me when you truly believed I had absolutely nothing to offer you." Rose angrily tapped her manicured fingernail against the hard wood of the table. "What a highly convenient melodramatic excuse," the matriarch sneered. Harper Sinclair casually opened her sleek leather briefcase and politely asked the clerk to provide a certified copy of the exact version they had just attempted to force Claire to sign. Penelope hesitated violently, stammering out that the document was still technically under active negotiation. However, the terrified clerk, now extremely cautious of the power dynamic, clearly informed the room that the draft had been formally presented for signature and must legally be registered as part of the official settlement attempt. Arthur's second attorney, a sharply dressed man named Michael Vance, confidently requested that the original digital file also be immediately preserved, strictly demanding the inclusion of the exact modification times dates and the specific sender's IP address. Penelope dangerously narrowed her eyes. "This is a blatantly hostile, intimidatory legal maneuver," Claire answered the desperate lawyer before any of her highly paid attorneys needed to intervene. Intimidatory was dragging me into this freezing room with a completely different version of the contract than the one you sent to my home yesterday. Rose leaned aggressively toward her son, her face twisting with rage. "Carter, are you honestly going to sit there and permit this outrageous behavior?" Carter opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no coherent sentence managed to form. Up until that very morning, he had arrogantly believed that permitting was the correct verb for everything involving his quiet wife. He had believed he permitted her to stay in his life, permitted her to leave the penthouse, permitted her to receive a pathetic financial settlement, and permitted her to retain some tiny scrap of dignity. Now, physically watching Arthur Barrett sitting like a king beside her, Carter finally realized with absolute horror that Claire had likely never needed his pathetic permission for a single thing in her life. She had simply patiently waited for basic human respect, and he had miserably failed to provide it. The clerk nervously cleared his throat and restarted the reading at Clause 13, the exact number the entire room was now fixated upon. The complicated text explicitly affirmed that Claire fully acknowledged possessing prior knowledge of and giving explicit consent to all corporate guarantees, massive financial movements, and complex banking instruments associated with the entire matrimonial period. Furthermore, she permanently waived any right to legally question any acts performed in her name by official representatives of Sterling Holdings or any individuals linked to the family's wealth management. Harper Sinclair immediately raised her hand, commanding the clerk to pause the reading. "Mr. Carter Sterling," the attorney said smoothly, "did Mrs. Claire Barrett ever occupy any official administrative position whatsoever within Sterling Holdings?" "Yours." Carter stared straight ahead, completely refusing to look at his seething mother. "No, she did not." Harper continued her relentless questioning without missing a beat. "Did she ever receive a formal legal proxy or power of attorney to operate corporate banking accounts on behalf of the company?" Carter swallowed the dry lump in his throat. "Not to my knowledge, no." Arthur calmly rested both of his large hands flat on the table, leaning forward slightly. "Then why, exactly, does your immensely wealthy family desperately need my daughter to permanently waive her right to question fraudulent financial acts committed in her name by representatives of your company?" "She wants $100." Rose reacted violently, acting as if the entirely logical question was a disgusting personal attack against her character. "Because Claire lived comfortably under our luxurious roof, she happily exploited our extensive infrastructure, and now she wants to weaponize our extreme generosity into a baseless criminal accusation." Michael Vance calmly unlocked a glowing tablet and slowly slid his index finger across the high-resolution screen. How incredibly curious. Right here, there is a direct mention of a massive corporate guarantee linked to an emergency commercial credit line that was hurriedly opened exactly 8 months ago. Mrs. Claire Barrett is officially listed as a related guaranteeing party, despite possessing absolutely zero corporate shares. Carter turned his head incredibly slowly toward Penelope, his eyes wide with disbelief. 8 months ago. Penelope desperately tried to maintain her freezing professional tone. "Carter, these are highly complex standard technical instruments used in high finance. Your mother personally oversaw every single detail alongside the corporate fiscal counsel." Carter's entire facial expression violently shifted upon hearing that specific admission. It was not yet a brave, heroic defense of Claire, but it was undoubtedly the very first massive crack in his lifelong pathetic obedience to his mother. "I absolutely never signed a single document involving Claire's personal name," he stated firmly. Rose quickly intervened, her voice dripping with venomous authority. "You signed a stack of general authorizations when you officially assumed the corporate presidency. Do not act like an incredibly naive, infantile child in front of these complete strangers." Claire felt a cold shiver run down her spine as she deeply analyzed Rose's choice of words. Strangers. To the great Rose Sterling, Claire was still nothing more than a temporary intruder, barely allowed to sit at the table even after enduring 3 full years of marriage. She was a stranger, despite having memorized the strict household schedules, Carter's specific coffee preferences, before board meetings, and the names of the invisible staff the family pretended did not exist. Arthur acutely noticed his daughter's painful realization, and his voice darkened with a terrifying protective anger. "My daughter is certainly not a stranger to a fraudulent legal document that illegally exploits her personal name." The second attorney, Michael, smoothly extracted a freshly printed piece of paper from his leather folder. "We also formally request that this specific document be immediately annexed to the official public record. It is a highly sensitive internal email that was carelessly forwarded exactly 3 weeks ago by the internal legal department of Sterling Holdings." Penelope's body went completely rigid in her chair. "What unauthorized email are you talking about?" Harper Sinclair adjusted her glasses and read only the most devastating essential sentence without adding any dramatic flair. "We desperately need to secure Claire's signature on the final waiver before Barrett becomes aware of the situation. The powerful name Barrett, spoken aloud from their own stolen correspondence, finally caused Rose to completely lose her carefully maintained composure. The thick social varnish violently shattered. "You have absolutely no legal right to illegally hack into the highly classified internal communications of our private corporation," she screamed, pointing a trembling finger. Michael Vance calmly revealed that no hacking had occurred. The email had been forwarded through a banking account linked to fraudulent loan documents that illegally listed Claire Barrett as a guarantor, exposing a clear trail of identity misuse. Carter was stunned and confronted his mother, Rose, who admitted she had used Claire's name to save the family empire for his benefit, turning what seemed like a divorce negotiation into evidence of possible corporate fraud. Penelope tried to defend the documents by claiming presumed marital authorization, but Harper Sinclair firmly argued that presumed consent could never replace explicit approval for protected private assets. When Rose mocked Claire's humble background, Arthur disclosed that Claire had long possessed substantial wealth, secured by strict legal protections, and had hidden it only to preserve the sincerity of her marriage. For the first time, Carter truly saw Claire beyond his mother's manipulation, and asked if she had hidden her fortune because she feared he would use her for money. Claire quietly replied that she had simply wanted the chance to be loved without her net worth being judged, but he had chosen to measure her value anyway. As the truth unfolded, Penelope realized that years of helping Rose with questionable legal tactics could destroy her own career. Harper demanded that the signing be suspended and every document preserved for investigation, while Rose angrily insisted the meeting was private and refused to be treated like criminals. Claire calmly answered that no one had used the word criminal yet, leaving the room frozen with tension. Carter then accused Claire of trying to ruin him, but she responded with dignity that she had never wanted revenge. She had only wanted a fair divorce and refused to let herself be robbed after years of betrayal and manipulation.